So welcome, good morning. I hope you guys had a good day yesterday too. We're going to talk about the Association of Shelter Veterinarians Shelter Standards Project, which actually culminated in a document called the Guidelines for Standards of Care. How many of you have seen the document? That's exciting. For those of you who haven't seen the document, it's available at sheltervet.org, which is the Association of Shelter Veterinarians website. And you'll see a button that looks just like this. And if you click the button, you can download the document. There's lots of other organizations that have the button as well, and will take you to sheltervet.org. I know that ASPCA Pro has the button. We have the button on the University of California website. So there's lots of other places, but you can always go here and find it there. So for those of you who have seen it, the next question is, how many of you have actually read it? It's a piece of work. It's a thick document to get through. So what I want to do today is talk a little bit about the project of what the Shelter Standards Task Force set out to do, what we actually did, and then I want to talk about kind of practical ways of using the document. And I'm going to actually walk you through a little bit of a presentation that was given by our UC Davis ASPCA fellow. We had a fellowship group last year, and the ASPCA fellow did a project where she worked with the standards document, and she evaluated a shelter, and she used a very systematic approach to how to apply the document to an organization. And so what I want to do is kind of walk you through a little bit what she did and introduce you to a tool that we have available to use. I'm all full of questions this morning, so how many of you have ever been to the UC Davis Koret Shelter Medicine website? Well, that's kind of fun that not so many of you have. It's sheltermedicine.com, and I'll be talking about it a few more times this morning, but you'll be able to find the Excel tool that I'm going to show you at sheltermedicine.com. If you search for Excel tool, it will come up. And you'll find that, so just so that you're aware of that. So here's the group of authors that made up the Shelter Standards Task Force, and these were the authors for the guidelines document, and it's 14 shelter veterinarians, and among the task force members, all of us, although we're all veterinarians, we worked in really a wide, and still do work, in a wide variety of positions. Including in administrative or director roles in animal shelters. Some are working as shelter veterinarians. Some are working in public health. Some are working at universities. And between the 14 of us, the amount of experience of time actually worked in shelters equal the hundreds of hours of experience working in shelters. And when we looked at the group of us, there were those of us who started as volunteers for no-kill shelters. There were those of us who started as animal control officers for large municipal shelters. And it was really interesting to us as our group came together to sort of see how the field of sheltering was represented amongst the group of 14 of us, and how broad a net we would have to throw to really think about what a shelter is. And we'll come back and talk a little bit more about that. There's a new foreword for the document, so if you downloaded the document when it first came out, I hope you'll go and download it again. The authors of the foreword were these national groups, which was incredibly exciting to us. And I can move this so I can read it a little bit. And this is a quote from the foreword that they wrote to the document. It said, "It's important to note that each of the organizations listed above and that have co-authored this foreword embrace the spirit and intent of the guidelines, both to raise the standard of animal care throughout our industry and to create a roadmap that will aid organizations with ongoing self-assessment and improvement. We strive for consistency and excellence in the programs and services provided to animals, and we believe that the guidelines, with their focus on meeting the needs of each individual animal without losing sight of the needs of the population as a whole, assistance in helping prioritize necessary change and applicability regardless of the type and size of organization will help every organization achieve these critically important goals. And for us, I can't tell you enough how much that meant to us to have their endorsement of the document. I'm going to go on now and talk about kind of what we were trying to do and what I think we did with the document, but it meant so much that really now this document is so well supported by the field as a whole. So the idea of putting together a document that was guidelines for standards of care in an animal shelter was a pretty big task to undertake. And the first step that we took in doing that was we actually hired a group of people to start collecting research material, because what we wanted to do is have the recommendations that we were making based on as much science as we possibly could. And so we ended up with 2 stacks about this high of research materials that were relevant to animals that were housed in animal shelters. And what we wanted was to make sure that the recommendations in the document would apply to any shelter caring for companion animals. And as I said, that's a really broad array of organizations. It was written by shelter veterinarians, but it was meant to be a tool to help advocate for quality animal care and well-being more effectively in shelters and in communities. And the idea was that it would be a tool for shelters themselves, for veterinarians in shelters, for staff in shelters, but also for the community, because we wanted to help the community. If the community wanted to advocate for change, we wanted to help them understand what kinds of change might be the most productive or might be the most helpful. And so we wanted the document to really be something that you could use to look inward and that the community could use to look inward as well. We also really wanted to emphasize the important contributions of shelter medicine. When I started working in the field of shelter medicine, it really didn't exist. And we've seen over the last 10, 15 years just an explosion of growth in shelter medicine. And even though a lot of the research that we turn to isn't necessarily new research, the idea of sort of pulling out research from other fields, from immunology, from infectious disease, and starting to compile that into a field that we understand to be shelter medicine is a reasonably new thing. Very, very exciting. And it gives us a way of understanding what's going on in shelters that's very different than before veterinarians were really looking at animal care and understanding infectious disease and well-being in animal shelters. So we really wanted to use what had happened over the last however many years to bring forward the recommendations that we did. So we've touched on this a little bit. What is a shelter? When we started thinking about it, it could really be any of these things. It could be, there's shelters in the United States that take in over 50,000 animals a year. Thank goodness, not too many of them, but there are. There's private humane societies, and there's private humane societies that work in all sorts of different functions. There's those with contracts, without contracts, open admission, limited admission, all sorts of different kinds of philosophies. There's rescue groups, foster homes, even groups that aren't housing animals, but that are just bringing animals from one place to another. We see those organizations all the time. There's sanctuaries, and there's even, I think it's a more recent development, organizations that are set up just to be hospice organizations. And so what we wanted was to be able to write a document that would apply equally to all of these different organizations and help give guidance on animal well-being. We base the documents on the 5 freedoms. How many of you have heard of the 5 freedoms before? Excellent. Does anybody know when they were written? Talk about new research. Any ideas? 1920. 1920. Any other ideas? Good guess. Are they recent or are they old? They're old. 1965. Does anybody know what they were written for? Were they written for shelter animals? What were they written for?
Scientific? Was it for research?
For research? No. For what? Agriculture. He's Canadian. So it was actually, I always have to read this one. It was a report of the Technical Committee to inquire into the welfare of animals kept under intensive livestock husbandry systems, otherwise known as the Bramble Report, easier to say. And I think for us, when we looked at these, we really felt like this was really a great way of summing up and sort of assessing animal needs. And especially if you try to use them from an outcomes-based perspective. So you're going to hear me say that a lot in this first hour this morning, is this idea of an outcomes-based assessment. And so what we did is we were looking at recommendations that we wanted to make. We asked in every case, we would bring it back to the 5 freedoms and say, well, if you're doing that, can you ensure meeting the 5 freedoms? If you're not doing that, can you ensure the 5 freedoms? And it was incredibly useful to have that as sort of a litmus test for each recommendation that we might want to make, or for each sort of practice or policy in an organization. Because even if there might be a really good justification for doing something that was happening, if you couldn't meet the 5 freedoms, then we didn't feel comfortable with that. And so that was a really, really important thing. And I have to tell you, we've had a few school groups, like elementary school groups, that have done little projects and sent us stuff on the 5 freedoms. And it's so incredibly touching to see them go through and really analyze how simple, and in many ways I think sort of obvious it is, that these are things that animals need. And I don't think there's anything here that anybody would say, well, they don't really need that. Freedom from fear and distress, that's not really important. Nobody's proved that, right? And so it was great to be able to have this as something to function from. So why did we feel the need for putting a document like this together? And one of the real reasons was that we felt that the cruelty statutes didn't ensure good care. So on the one hand, as I've said, we really wanted this to be a tool. And we wanted to be able to give guidance and advice. That's one side of it. The other side of it was that there really were no standards in place in many places. Sheltering is a very unregulated activity in most of the world, actually. And in some cases, municipalities or states are looking at trying to regulate things more. And we felt it was really important to have the guidance. On the other hand, there's this issue that the cruelty statutes that were out there really didn't ensure good care at all. And what they did instead is to really respond once something bad had happened. And so this is a way of looking at the 5 freedoms. So let me come over here for a minute. And if you look here, we have the 5 freedoms along the top. And this is a quality of life scale. And so you can see here you have high quality of life down to borderline quality of life, down to a life not worth living. And then we have the 5 freedoms here. And you can see that as the 5 freedoms sort of start to drop out, we say, well, here, happiness, all mental and physical needs met. This is competent caregiving up here, where either always or often the animal's needs are met. If they're rarely met, this is where we start to get into borderline caregiving. And at this point is where the animals are at risk. And I had the privilege of participating in a group that was veterinarians, psychologists, human physicians, people from the field of parental rights and child protection. And one of the things that we talked about is that this is really where we want to intervene, right? When people are at risk. And in the field looking at child protection, they've really come to the point where they understand that if you can evaluate what they even refer to as parental capacity for care, and if you find that the parental capacity for care may be somewhat lacking for what's needed for the particular child. What they found is that often, if you come in and give support at this point, things go much better. The child is able to stay in its home. The child grows. Abuse doesn't happen. All of those things. Whereas if you don't give support at this point, then we end up down here. And then this is where legally things need to start happening and interventions start happening. And there's a long history of correlation between child protection and animal protection. But if we look down here, this is where the cruelty laws apply. But really what we want to do is we want to intervene well before harm has happened. And so we thought if we started to think about guidelines for care and using this sort of understanding of quality of life, that we start to get to a place where we can understand potentially, could we start to intervene here in ways that might be more effective than intervening when something's gone wrong for a whole organization, right? That's impossible to do. I mean, it's not impossible. We do it. But it's not pretty, certainly. It's not easy. And it's usually, it's very difficult for the animals as well. And so, if we can start intervening here, sometimes by just giving guidance and advice is what's really needed, then hopefully we could always, or almost always, avoid getting here. Does that make sense? Does anybody have questions about this kind of quality of life scale? Yeah?
When does freedom from discomfort, when does freedom from pain and freedom from discomfort, when does discomfort become pain?
It's a great question. And I think that's one where, I think with all of this, when we're talking about quality of life and quality of life assessment, it has to be outcomes-based assessment. But I mean, you'll notice that really the truth is they're saying freedom from fear, discomfort, and pain. So, it doesn't really matter where the gray line is. There's a famous quote about that, right? Like, when is it night and day? Like, when does night turn into day? It's obvious when it's nighttime, it's obvious when it's daytime, but the time in between and when it actually switches is hard to say, right?
But pain is illegal and discomfort is not illegal.
Right. Right, and I think that part of what happens with that is there's degrees of everything, and this is something, it's a really good question because it also helps me to sort of illustrate how much thought and work went into the recommendations that are in the guidelines, because you have to be really careful if you say that an animal can never experience discomfort. That's taking things too far, right? Because sometimes an animal is going to experience discomfort in a shelter. I can almost guarantee that. I'm going to experience discomfort later today when I get on an airplane and go home. And so, that's the thing. And so sometimes that's going to happen. And I think that all of these things, to some extent, there always has to be an ongoing evaluation and assessment of degree and quantity and all of that. It's never black and white, right? Night and day are black and white, but the twilight is not. So just to make you aware, there's several places that we've done presentations and that we're trying to get the word out about the document and related materials that go with the document. So we did do, for Animal Sheltering Magazine, we did a series of articles called The Standards in Real Life. And there's an article by either me or Dr. Brenda Griffin every other issue for all of last year. And what we did is we did little case studies of shelters that had implemented recommendations from the guidelines and kind of how it worked out. And then we also did a series of webinars all last year on ASPCA Pro, and there's ongoing materials and other things like that on ASPCA Pro as well. We love to put those case studies together because I think it really helps put in perspective what's going on. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start now sort of going through this fellowship project that was done with us at UC Davis, and this is kind of my case study. One of the ways we've tried to sort of demonstrate how the guidelines can be implemented is to go through these little case studies. So what her project was, Crystal Mendegren is her name, and what she did was she analyzed 2 shelters. I'm really just going to talk about one with respect to the guidelines. And she used our Koret Shelter Medicine Guidelines Excel tool, and I'm going to show you that. She worked with staff and management towards guideline problem resolution is what they ended up calling it at their shelter. So what they did is they went through the guidelines and identified each place where there was a recommendation in the guideline that they weren't meeting as an organization. And so I'm going to show you this really specifically. And then what they did is they wanted to make protocols and policies and procedures that they could share with other organizations after they made the changes, so they could show that, you know, we implemented this and here's a protocol for how to do it. So her learning objectives for doing this was the goal for remedying the problems was to improve animal welfare, but it was really important to do that without causing any expense of life. So not to, you know, never to have the cost of increased euthanasia or anything like that be part of improving health and welfare in the shelter. One of the things she felt that was really important for shelters to think about when they were working on this was to put energy into the areas where change is likely to be or will be accepted. And one of the things that we found with all the fellows that we worked with this year who were all implementing recommendations at various shelters was that starting out with something positive and sometimes starting out with something pretty easy was great to help build momentum for making change. I don't know how many of you have tried making significant changes in shelters, but it can be really a complicated process and it can create an enormous amount of fear. And so if you can pick things at the beginning that are easy and successful, that really, really helps build momentum. And if you can do things that make it fun, that's even better. So she was focusing on the Humane Society of Central Oregon. These are just their stats for the 2011 calendar year, and these are here really only just to give you a sense of kind of what kind of shelter this was. They also perform owner-requested euthanasias at this shelter, and that's not shown in these numbers as well. This is just a few more numbers from them. So they have the pretty big foster program, lots of volunteers, lots of volunteer hours. They have nice housing for their dogs, a little bit less nice housing for cats. We'll come back and talk about that a little bit. This is their staffing. So fair number of staff, but not, you know, not jam-packed with staff, not really luxurious staffing. So the first thing that she did was to actually print out a copy of the guidelines document. And this is really her copy of the document. And she went through, and as she was reading through, anywhere she thought there might be a problem in her shelter, she highlighted. So, and when she's using the word problem, it's just a place where that shelter isn't doing what's recommended in the guidelines. So that was how she decided to do it. Now, when you look at the guidelines, what you'll see, and you'll find this in there's a section called How to Use This Document. The first thing you'll see is that there's definitions. So unacceptable is one of the recommendations. The recommendations will all fall into categories of either something is unacceptable, or the word must is used, the word should, or the word ideal. And so those are kind of the 4 levels. So an unacceptable means that no sheltering organization, regardless of its circumstances, budget, size, or anything, should engage in any practice that is deemed unacceptable. Unacceptable practices must be corrected without delay. A must means without adherence to this recommendation, the delivery of a minimal level of acceptable or humane care is not possible. Should implies a very strong recommendation. And then ideal is implementation might not be possible in all circumstances, but would certainly enhance care for the animals. And so ideal is kind of the place to strive to. The other thing I just wanted to talk about that we decided to use with her project was a problem prioritization system. And so what we did, if you look here, is this was the original one that we tried, and so we used unacceptable or must, should, and ideal this way, and then resources, it's dying. Resources went the other way. And so what you can see, I hope, from this is that if something was an unacceptable and it was low resources, that would be, thanks, that would be very high priority to do, right? It's unacceptable, easy to fix that now. And Krista, so there, we use this way of doing it. And then we also use this way of doing it. So high, medium, and low priority, which in many ways sort of fits right in with this, right? Because if it's an unacceptable, it should be, or a must, it should be a high priority. And so you'll see that as we go through. This is a screenshot that is very hard to see, I'm sorry, of the Excel tool, and what I can walk you through is kind of how it works. So it goes section by section. So there's a section called Management and Record Keeping, and this is the first recommendation in the document. See if I can read it any better from what I have here. I don't know why this got so blurry. Sorry, I can't read that. So what it says is, so here is the recommendation, and it's pulled out from the context that you would see it in the document. And then it tells you that the priority level is a must. And then it tells you what the sort of recommendation code is, which is something that just goes with, you can use that to prioritize. So, and then it tells you what section it's in. So it's management, and it's recommendation number 1. And then here it tells you the page number, and then I'm hoping this one will be a little easier to read, but it's not, sorry. Then you can go through in this column, basically you identify whether this is something in your organization that would need a remedy, is the way that we looked at it. So it's kind of a problems-based assessment of the organization, and you can use the Excel tool like a checklist. So instead of reading the entire document, as you're trying to sort through what you're going to work on in your organization, you can use this list where the recommendations have been pulled out. One of the feedbacks that we got from many people is, wow, that's a really long document. It's kind of intimidating to even get started. And so for many people, the feedback we've gotten from the Excel tool is that when you start going through kind of as a checklist, and then you can put down whether this is something that you are going to work on for your organization or not, and you can put down what the priority is for your organization in terms of using one of those square prioritization methods. So how many guidelines do you think there are total? How many recommendations in the document? Any guesses?
150.
Anybody else have a guess? 560. And you'll find all of those in the Excel tool. How many unacceptables? Oops, I gave it away. So 21 unacceptables, 232 musts. So not very many unacceptables, and I think that's important to really understand when you pick it up, because the first thing you'll probably really want to do is go through and sort of see, how many unacceptable practices do we have, and can we get rid of those right away. And then 277 shoulds and 29 ideas. So how long do you think it took for this shelter and this veterinarian to go through and sort of do this process of identification and prioritization? Is it like a day, week? What do you think?
3 months.
Good guess. I heard you too. 2.5 months it took her, because she's a full-time veterinarian too, right? And I think it's important for you to see that this is a process, and this is the reason I wanted to present this as really, what do we do with this book? We just got this giant book. What do we do with it? You start working slowly to change things, and even the process of going through and seeing what recommendations there are in the guidelines that your shelter is doing or isn't doing or anything like that. starts to change things. It starts to open your eyes to things that are happening. It starts to help you see things in a new way. And so over the course of the 2 months as she was identifying things, you know, it took a long time. And she jokes all the time that she didn't actually have the Excel tool because she made the Excel tool. We made it with her. But so she didn't have it, and you'll have it if you want to use it. So hopefully it won't take quite as long. But I still think the process is, expect it to be a little bit of a long process. It's a big undertaking, but totally worth it. They actually formed a group, and she provided assessment to the management team, and she would show them the Excel tools. She would give them copies of the guidelines to read. It was actually really funny at one point. She was doing, just as a little word on communication, she was doing all of this, and then when the Excel tool came out, we put a big announcement about it on our website, and her director actually sent her an email saying, like, hey, have you seen this? Isn't this great? She was like, we're using it. Because they had been using it, but they hadn't realized it was the same. So that was kind of funny. So here's the results that they found. And again, this is a nice shelter. And it's really incredible for them to be willing to be so open about this process so that other shelters can see that, you know, during this process, we don't expect that very many shelters are going to, if any, you know, are going to be meeting every recommendation in the guidelines for standards of care. When you go out to define what standards are, in some fields, the way they would do that, so like if you were looking at some agricultural fields, the way they would define standards would be to go out and see what everyone is doing. And then that would set the standard for the field. And we actively chose not to do that because we felt like, in very large part, what everyone was doing wasn't really based on any kind of cohesive thinking like the 5 freedoms. So we wanted to try to create guidelines that would change the bar. And so that's a little bit different. And so that's why when we brought it out, we didn't say these are the standards. We said these are guidelines for standards. This is a place for our field to try to go. Does that make sense? So again, so for this organization, they had 2 unacceptables, and they were surprised that they had unacceptables. They didn't think they were going to have unacceptables when they thought of, like, oh, this document came out and they heard about it. They didn't think of themselves as an organization that was likely to have unacceptables, but many do. Some of them are little, some of them are bigger. So here's where they were. And this is, we don't think of this as something where we would want organizations to go out and start scoring themselves. So I'm not presenting this here as something where you should say, like, oh, you know, let's give ourselves a score, let's compare ourselves to this other organization, because we don't think that that's a really meaningful tool. But we do think it probably is important to look at those unacceptables and say, you know, those are the ones we want to get to first. Let's just make sure we get rid of those. So they created a little group called Growing with the Guidelines, and they would meet and work on things. They would have staff meetings every Monday and get input on their issues. And they found that this was a much more successful route for them to take than when the veterinarian was just trying to work on this on her own and then implement changes that she had come up with. That there was a lot more resistance to that method of doing things than there was when they created this group called Growing with the Guidelines, and they included other departments as well. This Growing with the Guidelines group would report back to the management and to the board. They would have meetings with the management, update and they would try to have like a change a week. So they would have like something they were working on every week. And then again, the director said you need to make staff feel even more involved in the process. And so they started then starting to make the changes just once a month and making this monthly report. I wanted to show you this because this is the timeline for how they made the changes. So they had changes each week, and then you can see the cumulative changes kind of grow. And this is, Crystal is a very organized person, the way she likes to put things together, but I thought this was really kind of interesting just to see, you know, over time, you know, this is only 59 weeks, a little more than a year, and you can see, you know, over time 60 changes happen. But so nothing happened really, really quickly, but a lot of things happened in the end by kind of just this steady progress. And so they did end up averaging about 1 change a week for the first year. But at first, they averaged about 3 changes a week. And this is where I think this right here is where they had kind of given her some advice that she needed to slow down. So when we think about methods and we talk about doing this, if you haven't gotten this method, is that really it's important to identify resistance to change and also functional roadblocks. So sometimes there's kind of dysfunctional roadblocks, which are just that change makes people nervous. And sometimes there are really functional roadblocks that you need to look at and say, you know, how am I going to move this big log out of the road so that I can bring my bike past or something like that. You know, so there's really both kinds of blocks to moving forward. So again, she decided to use this problem resolution method, and this was what had kind of led us to the Excel tool to identify the problem at her shelter, how the problem would be remedied, how much it would cost, and then she's going to go through. So what I'm going to do is go through just a few examples of how this was done, and this is the method that she used in each case. So here's an example. Here's her prioritization. This is the unacceptable must column. So this was determine the identity of, so here's the recommendation from the guideline. Determine the identity of each animal to be euthanized with certainty beforehand, including scanning multiple times for microchip using a universal scanner. Their problem was they were only using an Avid scanner in the euthanasia room. And one of the comments that she made when she was talking about this project is, as the veterinarian, it would probably never have occurred to her to go into the euthanasia room and see what kind of scanner they were using, because like you're just going about your daily business. But if you go through this process, then you go check. And so there's something about doing this kind of self-consultation where you go through and do these kinds of observations. Have any of you seen the book, The Checklist Manifesto? It's a really great book, and it talks about how easy it is in our world that has become so complicated to miss really simple things if you don't have a checklist. So this is a great example of finding what is really a really simple problem. So, you know, why is it up here? What, you know, what's the resource investment in fixing this problem? $0. Move a home again scanner to the euthanasia room. Problem solved. But it would never have been solved if she hadn't gone through and kind of done this assessment. So now they have, you know, universal scanning. Sorry, I'm going to just click through. I've got 2 slides there. Okay. So some of these, I hope this is interesting, because some of these are like, they're really simple little things. It's not that you need me to tell you how to remedy that, but what I'm trying to do is sort of show you practically, well, how can you use this giant document that's hard to make your way through. So for this one, again, a must. You must remove feces from outdoor areas at least daily. And their problem was no protocol existed for doing that, to ensure that the grounds are checked for feces on a regular basis. And again, just nobody had thought about it for a while. And it might even be that it was actually happening most of the time, but there was no protocol in place. There was nothing to ensure that that was going to always get done. And so their remedy was to have kennel staff or community service there to remove the feces daily. And it took about 1 staff member approximately 20 minutes a day. This is, I don't know if you guys have seen this or not, it's a calendar that's all like poop in beautiful places. It's called the monthly dues. So again, like this was kind of surprising to her for where the caliber of her shelter was, but it was just for whatever reason something that just hadn't really been thought out, and there wasn't a protocol in place to do. Now there is. Here's another one, provide adequate grooming. And this one I've joked with Crystal a lot about because there's a lot of veterinarians who have talked to me about this particular recommendation and how happy they are that the guidelines document actually makes this point, because their problem was that the grooming wasn't considered necessary. So if an animal was in stray holding, I'd even heard it argued several times that if an animal was stray, that you couldn't groom the animal because the owner might then not be able to recognize their animal. And so that was the case here, that even if an animal was really badly matted, it would have to wait until the end of the stray holding period to get groomed. And again, any animal that's uncomfortable and or malodorous needs to be groomed. And you can see here this fur coming off in the, I'm sure lots of you have seen that classic matting, which is just awful. Anyway, so, it's really gratifying to see. Again, these are all, one, really easy to change these things, but how much does this mean to this animal in this case to not have to sit like that for 5 to 7 days waiting? Here's a should give enrichment the same significance as other components of animal care, such as nutrition and veterinary care, and it's not to be optional. Their problem was that behavioral health was not as concerning or obvious to staff as medical health. It wasn't something that their staff really spent a lot of time thinking about. So their remedy was to emphasize and give training on behavioral health to the staff. They had a volunteer coordinator that was included a whole new section on this during orientations. And they had a whole new sort of component of their daily rounds where they would look at behavioral health. Cost nothing. And then in addition, they decided to transition an employee to become an animal management coordinator. So this is a full-time staff member who spends 50% of her time just focusing on enrichment issues for the animals. So that one came out to a 5. In terms of, for this organization, it was a should, but it required kind of moderate resources to implement. Should design the shelter such that cats are not exposed to the noise of barking dogs. This is a really, really common one. Honestly, there were lots of us who felt like this one should really be a must, but again, from the perspective of just, how possible is it to achieve? So the current design allowed cats in the clinic to hear the noise of barking dogs, and it was only cats in the clinic. So for them, they started keeping doors closed that would have allowed the sound of barking dogs to come through. This, again, it sounds so simple. I cannot tell you how many shelters I've been to where really that's the remedy, but it just doesn't happen because people aren't thinking about it because you're not a cat. And so when you hear the sound of barking dogs, it doesn't seem as important to you as it might if you were a cat. And so if you can start to sort of think about barking and know that if you were a cat, you would get up and go close the door, and train your staff to do the same thing. The anticipated, so this is another thing I wanted you to be aware of, is that that's a partial remedy in her mind, and the anticipated full remedy would be to redesign certain areas so that the sound of barking dogs really doesn't come through at all, but you can imagine that the cost for that is, as Crystal says here, a lot. Here's another, provide long-term dogs with daily opportunities for activity outside of their runs for aerobic exercise. I'm just kind of curious, how many of you guys are able to do that in your organizations? Great, but not everybody. It's a hard thing to be able to do. So their problem was dogs awaiting behavior assessment in court holds were not walked by staff or volunteers and could remain for many weeks. So there were actually policies that said they're not allowed to be walked, and it was only, and so they just had to stay in their kennels. And the remedy was they assigned a staff member and gave them training so they could take out any dogs that are not allowed to be walked by volunteers. And it took, in cost, it was staff time of approximately 20 to 40 minutes every day. And so again, you can see that one, medium resources, pretty important still, but certainly something they were able to solve. This was a little bit more tricky. Provide alternatives to traditional caged housing, large enriched cages, home or office foster care room housing for any animal staying in the shelter long term. And long term is somewhat loosely defined in the document, but it's really about 2 weeks or longer, kind of starts to fall into that long term area. They have cats that have waited for weeks or months to move into a larger non-traditional housing unit, and there was no alternative housing available at all for dogs. So you can see this one is pretty high priority still, but now it's fallen into high resources, high priority, which is going to make it a much harder thing to resolve. But one of the things that I think is an important thing to think about, especially from a practical perspective, when you're trying to do this, is really the importance of thinking about these partial short-term remedies and then these full remedies, to strategically plan for those. You know, she's talking about a full remedy by June of next year. Some shelters may be thinking about a full remedy by June of 3 years from now. There's a shelter I'm working with now that, like, the remedy for them with what's going on with their cat housing is to build new cat housing. That's going to probably take 3 to 5 years, and they know that. And so they're trying to come up with partial remedies in the short term, but don't just say, oh, we can't do it, just because you can't get to the full remedy now. So for them, the partial remedy was to be able to only offer cats room in the cat area, space becomes available, but they were unable to provide any alternative for dogs, and that was kind of upsetting to them. They're going to have new cat housing, and we'll hope for a new contract with the city or county for their court cases so that they can, what they're trying to do, this was just done actually where I live in Wisconsin, where they were able to have a new law that expedited the custody of the animals in legal cases so that the animals don't fall into an endless legal limbo, that at least what's going to happen to the animals gets decided earlier on in most cases, most legal cases. So that's pretty much all I have about that practical stuff. What I was thinking I might do, well, first I wanted to just tell you that we are really interested in collecting case studies from shelters. We have a whole slew of them. I'm just showing you this one today because we had a shorter amount of time, and I really wanted to let you see kind of the practicality of using the Excel tool. What I'm going to do is I want to get through there's just a couple more slides I want to just show you, and then I was going to open up the Excel tool so you can see it a little better, because I'm not sure why it was so hard to see on those slides. But so we really do want to know if you're working with the guidelines, and this kitten used to say success, we want to know, but the truth is we want to know even if you're trying things and it's not working. We want to hear about it because it's great for us to understand what people are doing with the guidelines document, how you're using it, and what experiences you're having as you're trying to implement the recommendations. So please do let us know, and if you're interested, we'll even use you as case studies in some of our presentations. We have a whole slew of presentations that organizations have put together on their own that we use. So thanks. I wanted to also let you know that we just started our UC Davis Koret Shelter Medicine team, just started a new blog this weekend called Foster Fun with Dr. Newbury. And it is featuring my new kitten, Gigi. And I wanted to thank the ASPCA for the grant that makes my position possible, the partnership that makes my position possible.